Well, it's a delight to be here and also to be with Richard, whose work I've admired for many, many years. 20 minutes. What are we done? Did we get this off? Thank you. 20 minutes. What can we do in 20 minutes to open the discussion? First, let me give you two web pages. One, my long, complex name, add a column to it, and www to find lots more material. And community-wealth.org. www. And you'll find there surveys of many on the ground, thousands on the ground, real projects that change the ownership of wealth, build community, and move in the direction of the solution. So if you're interested in how to, know that the press doesn't cover a lot of this, but it is rampant throughout the United States. And that's one of the things we need to conquer. So let me, the Chinese have a wonderful expression. They say, if you want to deal with a big problem, you must walk on two legs. You must, and from the point of view of what we're talking about here today, how do we deal today, now, with what you can do really in your own community, in your own work, in your own politics, in your own strategy? And also, how do you build for the long haul a strategy, knowledge, theory of how to transform the largest corporate capitalist system in the history of the world? If you don't deal with that second one, and are only walking on one leg, you will fall down. So I want to suggest to you two things in the very short time we have available. That there is a growing awareness, not only of the problems we're talking about in terms of growth, but of the genuine crisis of American corporate capitalism and in some other countries of capitalism in general. So that presents a problem. If you don't like capitalism, and you don't like socialism, what do you want? And if you don't know, why should we talk to you about where you're going? I'm talking to the person in your seat. We have not stepped up to the question of how you transform a system beginning tomorrow to build an answer to these questions. So my suggestion to you is you have to go in both directions. You have to begin now, and you need to begin developing theory and politics that move in the new direction. My suggestion also is that you are living in an era, we are living in an era, where it may well be possible, I'm a historian and political economist, it may well be possible, one never knows, I'm going to say it carefully, to lay the foundation for a transformation that is irreversible. I didn't say you can change the system. I said that we, in our era, have the opportunity, perhaps, to lay the foundations, it's a big deal, for an irreversible transformation. So what does that mean? That means that this generation, my heroes, just to give you perspective, are the civil rights workers in Mississippi who could be hung from a tree and tortured before they were hung in the 1930s and 40s. They laid down a foundation for a transformation that was irreversible and exploded in the 1950s and 60s. I think that's where we are with regard to these questions. What that also means, if you want to play this game, the chips are decades of your life. Don't bother unless you want to throw a few decades of your life on the table. You're talking about the largest, most powerful system in the history of the world. And you're talking about trends that are very powerful and disruptive. that have implications, because if the scenario, and I think the scenarios that Richard has laid out in his book in more detail, they imply crises, they imply authoritarian possibilities, violence, as the growth collapses. This is a very powerful period of history. Again, we could go into that at greater length. So, with that kind of overly dramatic introduction, but that's where, that's where we're at. Seriously. And I ask you to think about that, not to. Where do you go? Where do you begin? Well, systems, historically, by and large, run on who controls the property. Now, that's an overly simplified idea, but it is, in fact, likely to be true, and is true most obviously. Feudalism, the lords controlled the land, that was the main property, and they controlled the action. In 19th century capitalism, small entrepreneurial businesses, mainly farmers, the American farm businesses, remember, they are and were businesses. That's not European peasants. We're operating in a capitalist corporate market, and they were highly decentralized. The vast majority of Americans were either small business people or farmers, and there was something like an actual free market capitalist system, which had democratic and populist implications, though by no means perfect in many other respects. But the property was widely dispersed, much more dispersed than now. That's where the power was. In state socialism, the state had the power and the capital. And in our system, the corporations dominate a corporate capitalist system, highly concentrated, and getting more concentrated in virtually every major sector, by the way. I happen to be talking to an expert, an investment expert, a financial expert, a progressive financial expert. Now the game is, why concentration is increasing, now the game is to capture, that you can't capture markets, you capture your opponents to get pricing power, so that you can get a semi-monopoly power. But concentration is increasing. The ownership of this system, this number is so difficult to grasp that I had to check it several times, so I ask you to kind of look at this number and just look at it. 400 people, 400 individuals own more capital in this system than the bottom 160 million Americans. It is an extremely concentrated system. So among the many things that would have to change if we were to achieve a solution, and there are many, clearly we would have to find, if you want to change the system, a way, and if you want to do it in a democratic form, you would have to democratize the ownership of capital. Now, what does that mean? There are many things to do. But among other things, how would you do that that both created a democratic ownership pattern and a culture of community that could sustain and nurture the kind of values that would be necessary to solve these kinds of problems? Both and. Power and community and culture. Both and, not either or. Well, if you look around, and the press doesn't cover this, there are lots of ingredients on the ground already that most Americans don't know about, which are either building or available for existing transformation if you want to bother. The ball always ends up in your court, my court. So for instance, you probably are not aware that there are 10 million Americans who work in worker-owned companies that they own in America. 3 million more than are members of unions in the private sector. 10,000 companies already out there, many of which are ripe for transformation in the new generation towards a more ecological vision or a more participatory vision if you get in there and begin to work with it. 130 million Americans are members of co-ops and co-op credit unions, 40% of the society. Shells of institutions in many cases. Americans are now moving money largely into credit unions because they are a democratized ownership of wealth. Banks, the credit union. They are waiting to be taken over. Most of the meetings that occur in credit union elections are very small numbers of people who don't care anymore. They're an institution of Hulk that a democratizing movement could move and begin moving the investments towards community building, towards cooperative development. They exist. There are hundreds, indeed thousands now, of land trusts. 30 years ago, land trust, that is a community form of ownership of land, both important for ecological reasons and to prevent gentrification and to transform the ownership of housing. Those didn't exist until the late Bob Swan, 35 years ago or so, maybe 40, in Western Massachusetts, put together the first one. And now they're all over the country preventing gentrification and tell you something about, think about this. 35, 40 years ago, the idea of collective ownership of land was regarded as crazy. There was one in Georgia also, the Sherrods did one. We could have community ownership of land and then build housing and control land prices, control the environmental impact. That's communism. They're all over the country now. Irvine, California, not the hothouse of these ideas, has established one for 10,000 units, 10% of the land. Interesting about the decades. 35 years, I said throw a few decades of your life on the table. Bob Swan and others have shown that that is what happens if you do it, maybe. No guarantees. But in fact, there are many patterns like that. I'm going to digress briefly to tell you about, I happened to work with steelworkers in Ohio, in Youngstown, 1977. The first major collapse of a steel firm, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, threw 5,000 workers out onto the streets in one day. In 1977, that was headline news all over the country. Every station, every television station, all the newspapers, front page, because it hadn't happened. That was news. Now it happens every day, so it's not news. The workers and community religious leaders in that town got an idea that they ought to set up a worker-owned company in steel mills. And they got massive support. They even forced the conservative governor of the state, Rhodes at the time, and all the legislatures and the Carter administration to support their plan with promises, with a pledge of $100 million and more to come in loan guarantees. They were going to do it. What happened was the big corporations and the United Steelworkers, the international, not the local workers, the international, killed it and went to the Carter administration and destroyed that possibility. The people who did that understood they were maybe not going to make it. Think about the 30-year question. They knew that they might not make it. They were hip. They knew there was a tough game. They didn't expect easy answers. So they thought minimally what we're going to do is build an education system to teach people about this idea, and if we fail, we win. In Ohio, over 35 years, there has been the development of worker-owned companies and increasingly participatory companies, and the development of a process so that in Ohio and Cleveland right now, you have the most advanced and most sophisticated, most interesting projects any place in the country. The Cleveland model, which our group had something to do with helping the groups there, is a complex of worker-owned co-ops linked together with a revolving fund, linked together with a community nonprofit corporation. Think about that carefully. It's not just one co-op. Worker co-ops, you have to look at them carefully. Some are good, some are bad, some sell out to make more money, some are environmentally interesting, some aren't. Most of them don't have a culture of community larger than themselves. I'm a co-op. I believe in co-ops and think they're very important. And I urge that we develop them. But you also have to, if you're talking about transforming the system, ask about the principles. Most of them are about the co-op, the worker-owned co-op, and whether it can survive successfully. The Cleveland model links them to the fate of the community, to build the community as you build the worker-owned co-ops. It is a complex system aimed at community rebuilding, entirely green. All the co-ops in this structure There's a laundry that is perhaps the greenest laundry in the Midwest. There's a solar installation firm, co-worker co-op. There is a greenhouse that's about to be opened with a production capacity of 3 million heads of lettuce a year, and so on and so forth. These are larger co-ops. These are not your little tiny co-ops, based in part on the Mondragon model. But also interesting in this brief time, I want to give you a difficult principle. Co-ops on the ground, and we need more of them because they teach people principles, are operating in a market. And if the market forces them to either grow or to pollute or die, they will pollute or grow rather than die. Most of them. The Cleveland model uses the purchasing power of nonprofit corporations, which have a lot of taxpayer money, like universities and hospitals, like this university and your university, to buy from these worker co-ops, part of their purchasing, to both stabilize the co-ops, to stabilize the community. This is a community of 40,000 people with an average income of 18,000, black community, and 40% unemployment. To stabilize the community by using purchasing power to help stabilize a highly communitarian structure. That is a model, theory, that is a model of partial planning using a public or quasi-public taxpayer dollars in medicine and healthcare and education to help stabilize a very decentralized community building system in miniature. If you did it on the national level, it would be the national government investing in mass transit, high-speed rail, setting up a public worker and community corporation to build it, instead of selling off General Motors when the taxpayers had put in the money and the profits began to roll. It would then stabilize communities on a larger scale and use the market as a check. The old socialist markets were terrible. But competition too. I said it's more complex. The Cleveland model, importantly, begins to sketch a larger systemic model and some of the principles of a radically decentralized, community building, sustainable model that is also addressing principles of how you might organize a system in miniature. Fortunately, there are many cities now wanting to do this all over the country. Very interesting. Breaks through politics. In Cleveland, it's not left-right. You find the businessmen, the market increases locally. You find the unions like it. You find that the work. It has a very different politics because it builds the local community. They're doing one in Pittsburgh and they're doing one in Atlanta, 3 in the Washington, D.C. area, 1 in Amarillo, Texas, believe it or not. So you've got to get your mind around this. If you want to do this stuff, if you actually thought it through and it makes sense, rather than rhetoric, you can talk to anybody about it. I can talk to my old, very conservative high school buddies in Racine, Wisconsin, where I'm from, and say, doesn't this make sense? And they say, yes, and the ideology disappears. It's also a system that does not have to grow. I could go on, my time's going to run out, but what I want to suggest to you is the walking on 2 legs. What you can do tomorrow locally is critical, and there is a lot. If you want to find out about it, people are doing it all over the country. This stuff is happening, and you can do it if you want to. And people are beginning to develop a vision of what you do at the higher levels. And projects. The Bank of North Dakota, which is a public bank, there are 15 states that introduced legislation for the Bank of North Dakota type thing. Many cities are using their money. Big deposits to force banks to invest locally. There are programs, 27 states invest now in the ownership of businesses, which can be transformed in this direction. There are many experiments going on at different levels that can be transformative if your goal is to lay down the foundations upon which a transformative systemic change might be possible. I'm a realist. It may be that nothing is possible. They may win. It may be that violence will occur. that fascism and repression out of the pain this scenario is going to create will occur. It may be that we will just do some good things. And it is just possible that in following the power of the moral quest, that we may lay down the foundations of the next system in our time. Thank you very much.